Peter by introducing him. We're both getting on a bit, Peter rather more than me. He's ignoring me. But we first worked together about 20 years ago. We did a film about the election in 2005. We subsequently did, I was a producer at Dispatches, Peter was a reporter. We subsequently did a film about Iraq. We subsequently did phone hacking. And we've done various things together over the years. Now, since I first met Peter 20 years ago, Peter has been on a quite extraordinary journey. Peter at various times has been the sort of chief political commentator of the, you tell me if I miss any out, all sorts of newspapers that people in this room will be very fond of. The Telegraph, the Mail, sorry to embarrass you here, the Express, the Spectator. Have I missed any? And the Standard.
The Evening Standard.
The Evening Standard.
I love
I'm
Evening
quite
Standard.
sad.
The Evening Standard sent me to Gaza in 1995 when John Major was meeting Yasser Arafat. I think it was quite a thing.
Peter's other mic.
Anyway, so as you will be aware, Peter has been on this extraordinary journey. Peter today is certainly not the chief political commentator for those publications. In fact, I don't think you'll mind me saying, he's effectively become a pariah. And there are two things, but it's true. There are two things that happened with Peter, and you correct me if I'm wrong there. One of them is a journey that I think began even before we met, which began with the Iraq War, which was simply a horror at the way British media and the British establishment and the British political class related to the Middle East. And in a way, I think it was only somebody who came from Peter's position who could have done this. It was a realization that not only was the right-wing press, particularly after 9/11, profoundly Islamophobic, but also, for whatever anyone says, it's actually the acceptable racism for white liberal middle class people. And he I think, recognized that a profound injustice was being done to Muslims in this country in many ways. He did a lot of work on the Trojan Horse affair. And of course that led him as well to Palestine. The whole Corbyn anti-Semitism thing, he just sort of broke ranks with everyone else on that. The other thing Peter did, and I've realized this to my cost as well, is he made the mistake of criticizing other journalists. Okay? Now, Peter developed the concept of client journalists, and the older I've got, the more I've realized that this is a concept that has enormous validity. It's people who exist not to challenge power, but to serve it, whose relationship, while there's no reason why one shouldn't have a perfectly pleasant, friendly relationship with politicians, but whose relationship becomes far too cozy and who become access dependent. Actually, case study in this is Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, yes, who is probably one of the most catastrophic faceless apparatchiks in history. The man is the Undertaker of the Labour Party. He really is. I mean, he is the man who's going to destroy the Labour Party. Do you ever see a squeak of criticism? It's very slightly recently you begin to see squeaks of criticism of Morgan McSweeney, but the tight rein he has on the lobby is extraordinary. So Peter made a great mistake. There's a great interview Peter does with Krishna and Gurram Murphy in the autumn of 2019, where you can see the precise moment when Peter becomes a pariah, when he's invited to expound on the concept of client journalism, and does, to the horror. And the result is the man you see before us today. But Peter's book is extraordinary. I would recommend everyone to buy it and to read it. I don't think I need to say to this audience the centrality that Gaza has in our lives. It's hard to convey the degree of alienation one feels from the political media establishment over the issue of Gaza. And the only solace one has is that we are the vast majority. There is no other issue on which the political media class is so bizarrely detached and cut off. And the result of that is they won't review Peter's book. You won't see it covered in the media at all. But it's an extraordinary book. It's an enormously important book historically. In 50 years' time, it will be a very, very well-known book, and I would recommend you all to read it. Peter, you can correct now all the things I've said about you. Do you want to go straight into questions?
Go into yeah.
Straight into questions. So I'm going to kick off the questions, but very quickly I'll open them out to the audience. A very simple question to start with. Why did you write this book?
I was almost exactly a year ago. I was in Nablus in the West Bank, which is many people here will know what a beautiful city it is. I was sitting on a roof terrace of those old Ottoman houses inside the old city. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
And I was looking at the sky and the stars, over which very recently I think there have been missiles from Iran heading towards Tel Aviv going over. But I looked and I suddenly realized I had to write this book, which is now published, and it's really about Britain's role in Gaza. I'm by training a political journalist. I do understand how politics works at Westminster. I was asked by Channel 4 to do a film on the pro-Israel lobby in Britain. This was 15 years ago, and so I have quite a deep knowledge of how the Israel lobby works. I also have written 2 books about political lying. I know how political lies are told. In particular, that they require the press not to call them out. In other words, it needs the assent and the complicity of the press. And I've been traveling a lot in the Middle East, particularly in the West Bank, with Israel, a bit in Gaza, and Iran, and I'm working for Middle East Eye, so I had I wouldn't say a deep understanding, but a working knowledge of the movements in Palestine and Israel. And putting those 4 together, I realised I was able to write a book which would describe Britain's role in the destruction of Gaza. I then went away and I basically didn't do anything else for the last 10 months. I went and lived on my own in Wiltshire and researched and wrote the book. And I've done my best. I could hear the bombs going off on the Salisbury Plain. Actually, it's not far from where I live. Artillery fire rattling my windows as I researched and wrote the book.
I'm just going to indulge myself before I open it up with one more question. Although you and I are now cast into the outer darkness by mainstream media, I think we'd agree that most of the people we used to work with, they're not monsters, they're not wicked human beings who wake up every morning thinking, how can I murder some children today? Yet, in effect, for the last 2 years, that's what they've done. How is it that the British political establishment and journalistic establishment has ended up in this place where day after day they are effectively manufacturing consent for genocide?
It's a very good question, and it's one of the questions actually I do set out to answer in the book. And there are all kinds of. I think we can divide up my former colleagues, many of whom are or certainly were very good friends of mine or mentors of mine in some cases. I think I'll try and break down the various typologies. I think most contemptible of all is the shock jock in the Talk TV or the GMTV studio, whose job is to create controversy. They know nothing at all. They're probably on a lot of money. And they know nothing at all really about Israel or Palestine, and they tend to be very much on the side of Israel. And then there's the hard-working reporter, and they somehow their stories are pro-Israel. And I think, and I've been in that position. I was a reporter, and you're sent by your newspaper, and you've got to get a particular story. And with the help of Richard, actually, I analysed the coverage of October the 7th itself. And you can see the journalists going out there being fed lies, actually. I mean, look, Hamas created enough atrocities of its own. You didn't need to invent further lies, the 40 dead babies and so on. And that is, and I think that hangs on the consciences. Some of these stories they sent back are still up there. You can go and read them. And they were used to devastating effect by the Israeli regime, or government, I should say. No, that's not regime is the wrong word. But used by Netanyahu to create this idea that there's something unspeakably barbaric about Palestinians, and that justified how Israel would conduct itself once it went into Gaza. Then we have the two sides chap. That's the BBC man normally, actually. You, on the one hand, we have, they don't know much about it, but on the one hand, they have what the Israelis are saying about the atrocity which just killed 15 children. And on the other hand, you have the Palestinian version. And so you'll get a bit of both. And that is called balanced journalism. And that, I think, is a major sort of disease almost. And the BBC's particular, who's by no means the worst offender in any of this. Then we have but that is what they're taught to do. Then you have another kind of journalist who, all I can say is they hate Muslims. I think this is if you look at, I assembled some of the quotes. I have a section called media bigotry. The Telegraph headline, admitting Gaza refugees would be proof that Britain has a death wish. Somebody called Richard Ferrer, who wrote in the Daily Express about the Hamas attack as a plain and simple historic Islamic bloodlust, passing down the generations from birth, an ever-present cancer and so on. Now that's horrific. It's still there. I think they changed the word Islamist to Islamic. And there's a lot of that. And I give examples of these kinds of hateful, I think it has to be said, bigoted discourse. And then what are the other types of journalists? The high-minded commentators. And then the straight propagandists. I think these have been very, very important. And you can follow their fortunes. He just presents, Douglas Murray is probably kind of the best example of this, writing in The Spectator and elsewhere, and The Sun. And really it's just a portrayal of a simplistic misunderstanding of what's going on in the area, and it just from one point of view. And he presented it, how Palestinians are part of a death cult, and Israel represents sort of civilization. It's an adaptation of the Huntington thesis. It's drawing on a number of sort of ideological positions. Another one is the war of civilizations, and also the thesis was the Renault thesis about the capture of the West by Muslims. And that's 5 different kinds of versions. And then, of course, we have the people who simply don't know what they're talking about. And I think they're the most... if you go, it's a wonderful place to go and have breakfast. I can't afford dinner there very often. It's called the Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem. And there's a wonderful bookshop owned run by Mahmoud, and I go in, and he told me this story not long after, about November 2023, he said that this sort of well-known TV reporter came into his shop and asked for a book on Palestine and Israel. And she's quite well known. She'd been out there for several weeks. He thought that she might know what. So he offered her the latest Abby Schlein book, the latest piece of scholarship on, from the universities. And she ended up with taking away a basic primer on Israel and Palestine. Now, the point he makes was that really, if you go to Israel in that position, you're going to be briefed endlessly by the Israeli propaganda people, by the IDF. She would have been in no position to challenge what she was being told. That's not at all. All she would have been able to do was to take briefing from the Israeli government. I think this ignorance is very, very significant. People don't actually understand, and maybe they don't want to understand, but they don't understand.
Yeah, I know that story, of course, the key significance of that story is she is buying the primer to read on the plane going home. She's buying on her last plane, not her first plane. Okay, questions? I can't believe no one has a question. Lady over there.
Hello.
Now, are we going to pass around microphones? How are we going to do this?
That's for
I think we're okay with sound.
Let's
Let's try.
Shall I stand up? Yeah.
Yes.
But while you're standing up, there's one, of course, and then there's a final. I apologise. I just left out. I have something very important. The journalists on the ground in Gaza. Hundreds of whom have been killed, targeted by Israelis, and they have brought us the stories, and I doubt they get paid hardly anything. Every day they're likely to be targeted and killed, or just killed. And that remark by David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary at the time, that there are no journalists in Gaza, which he never has apologised for or corrected. And so you have and these people, these utterly dedicated people, have brought us the truth day after day at enormous personal risk, not just to themselves but to their families. And you compare them to these sorts of loud-mouthed former colleagues of mine in many cases, who sit in their TV studios being very well paid just slagging off Palestinians who know nothing. And it's very shaming.
And where is the unity and the solidarity of Western news organisations? I remember, as I was working at Al Jazeera, a few months back, the Israelis published a list of 6 names of our journalists who they said were Hamas. And I wrote to a number of people I know saying, everything in our experience up to now tells us that these are death threats. They are testing for water to see if they can kill them. Do not report this as though the Israelis say this, Al Jazeera says this news story. They are testing whether they can murder them. Of course, everybody news outlet reported it as a he says, they say news story. And sure enough, I think it's 1 so far of those 6 have been murdered. Anyway, lady over there.
I was just going to ask a question about Robert Fisk, and I miss him. I think we all miss him. Do you feel that the lack of context is one of the problems that we have with our media? We don't have an explanation of why this might happen. What's your thoughts on that?
So could you repeat the question on the mic?
Yes, so the lady mentioned Robert Fisk, and she's asking if one of the problems we have in the Middle East is the absence of journalists like that who can provide a sort of broader context to what's going on.
Obviously, and the biggest point, of course, was the presentation that October the 7th came out of nowhere at all. It was just a sort of act of nihilistic, anti-Semitic hatred coming out of nothing. And of course, you have to understand, it's not to condone or to to support what Hamas did. It's simply you have to understand the deep background going back to 1948 and the Nakba in order to understand what happened on October the 7th and subsequently. And of course, Fisk is one example. I'm not going to be too rude about some of the BBC correspondents. I think Jeremy Bowen does know what he's talking about, at least through sects. They do bring a wisdom and a knowledge. You can criticise their reporting, but there are journalists who do bring that context and understanding, and do, by the way, get pilloried by the Israelis as a result.
I mean, you do have a handful of journalists who clearly know what they're talking about, and you can almost see them visibly walking a tightrope between what they're allowed to say and they're not. Alex Crawford for Sky is
Yes, another very good
she's
example.
excellent as well. Anyway, another question. Right at the back there. You just have to shout. Does this? No, right.
No, that's correct.
This is just a prop.
This is here. No, this is for this camera.
Oh, I see. Sorry. All right. If you could just shout, and then for other people, I'll repeat the.
Yeah, it's actually kind of not a question, if you don't mind. I just came to kind of tell you. Yeah, it's a bit weird. My name's Ahmed Baines. I did journalism at uni, and I did a story for Declassified UK with John McAvoy. Asaf Kaplan, you guys know Asaf Kaplan. He tried to pay me to post on social media, on my social media, and I blew the whistle on it. And that made me realise that the Israel lobby is mad.
Sorry. To be clear, who was it that was trying to pay you to post on social media?
Asaf Kaplan.
Oh, Asaf Kaplan.
He's an ex-Israeli spy. He's in the Labour government, as revealed by Asa Winstanley in 2021, electronic intifada. And yeah, he worked as a social listening manager for Labour. Before then, he worked in Unit 8200, a unit which is spied on Palestinians, and they used to count the blood on their headsets, how they were described. And I was contacted, and they didn't tell me who they were, Israel Labour. They offered me £50 a week to post on my social media, and it was. Yeah, they didn't tell me anything about it. Anyway, I worked for 2 months with John McAvoy, and I exposed the story. So yeah, that was crazy. But I suppose my question was, like, I don't know what to do, because I did that story and I've made no money, and I've got no help. I've got journalists coming to me, BBC, I've got nothing. I contacted my local paper, they weren't interested. So I do journalism at uni, 25 years old now. Unemployed, unfortunately. How do I get a job in the media whilst having these kind of views? Because it seems to be pretty dystopian and pretty terrible. So yeah.
Okay, so but Declassified did run your story.
Yeah, I'm classified. Yeah, John.
Yeah, and Asaf Kaplan was working for the Labour Party at that time.
Yeah.
Seems an extraordinary story. But this is a classic example of how things that ought to be big stories just don't get picked up. Now, how do you make it? You're asking two people who used to make a perfectly good living and stop making a living. I mean, I think the answer is don't write about Palestine, I'm afraid. But Peter, you might want to answer.
Well, Richard's advice there is extremely good. Don't write about it. It's not going to make you any friends. It's not going to advance your career. I frequently get asked by young journalists around your age, how do I get on? And I give them, you basically have a choice. You can have a monastic existence, a kind of in which you follow what you want to write about, but you're going to find it very difficult to get published, and even more difficult to get paid. What I tend to say to young journalists is actually learn how to go and work on it as a mainstream journalist for a while, learn the trade, and 10 years later, once you've learned what you're doing, once you've mastered it, then you can go in and you've got more of and write about the things you care about. This is the personal advice I give people, again and again. People, otherwise you're likely just to end up, I say just to end up, it's very important, you're likely to end up as an activist, because you're not going to be able to get published. And that's the advice I would. Let's have a chat afterwards, by the way, I'll talk to you.
Yes, sorry, that is slightly depressing advice, but yes, let's talk afterwards. All right, go on then. Go on, you might say that.
Two questions, Peter. One, I think you're...
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah,
I should be
sorry.
saying this, Steve, actually. Introduce yourself first.
Rizwan Habib, Director of Centre for Media Monitoring. We've worked closely with Peter on many occasions. I think you're far more forgiving of journalists, even from the BBC and Channel 4, etc., because you know within our analysis, none of them did their job at the beginning of the war, and very much long after it, and we've only seen real change from this year onwards. So we have a whole year's worth of coverage where even the BBC would now acknowledge no context, your Jeremy Bowens, Lise Doucette's, who I think was particularly very disappointing given her knowledge about the subject. So I think they failed, and I suppose the question is, can journalism and journalism redeem itself now, given how obvious the bias has been from all media outlets?
Did everybody hear Rizwan's question? Because it's a very important one. And I've been put in my place.
She always does it very politely. It's not the first time
that she's done this to me. I've drawn very heavily on the work of the centre you lead, the Centre for Media Monitoring, and you've done amazing work, and you've basically put two major reports. One very early on, after maybe the first 6 months of the war, and then another one came out 6 months ago, and it's immensely valuable and of great historic importance, because it does enable, it is very well researched, and it does enable you to assess and see how bad the British media has been. And I accept maybe I was too generous. Maybe I was thinking rather too much of the recent reporting from the Jeremy Bowen and people like him. You're right, the BBC, and it's all set out in your report. You can go and read it, and I do recommend what you've done.
Can journalism redeem itself?
Okay, sorry, can journalism? No, I think that it can only redeem itself if it comes to terms with the gross errors of reporting and comes to terms with them and admits it. And there's no sign really of that at all. Newspapers are in general very bad indeed at admitting they got something wrong. I remember they were all for the gung-ho for Iraq invasion, and after a few years they didn't support Iraq. They didn't say we were wrong, we were mugged. And so I don't think there is any, and I think this is a very terrible way to go. I mean, I've been a journalist for 40 years, and I was very, I don't know about pride, I enjoyed being a journalist. And I think it's devastating for the reputation of British press, which was once held up in great high esteem, and they have to admit it, and they're not going to.
I'll just butt in there to be slightly more optimistic, perhaps. I think always the challenge facing the left is how you convert anger into power. And in times when it's sort of going well for the left, it's how you convert numbers into power. Now, as I said, there is no issue on which the political media class is more out of touch with the population, and it's a matter of, I think every media organisation, every NGO is a battlefield, basically between the old white buggers who run it and everyone else, okay? And in time, I hope those battles will be won. Gaza, appalling though the price paid by the Palestinian people has finally discredited the political media class. And they don't realise how discredited they are, but they are completely discredited. Yeah. And I think it's a matter of, we just need to sweep these old buggers away. As Ben LePere says, the solution at the BBC is for the entire management structure to go. They all have to go. And, in an ideal world, that this bloody left-wing party would actually be able to organise itself. Because if they did, these buggers would all lose their jobs at the election as well. But that's the way to do it. I don't think the current generation of journalists can redeem themselves. They need to be replaced. With the exception of me and Peter, of course.
The one thing which, of course, has been the case is that the smaller outlets, the alternative outlets, have done astonishingly well. Like Declassified, I think the Bar has been very good. Mondo Vice, plus quite a lot of these. Haaretz has done some staggering reporting. 972, and I'm leaving out Middle East Eye, for which I write. I'm very proud of. And electronic interface. There's been some stunning reporting, and I think that is very significant for the future too.
Yeah, and the whole independent media ecosystem has sort of come into its own with Gaza. I think, and that ties back to what the guy at the back said earlier. Anyway, he was first. Gentleman there with the glasses.
I've